MINDMELD Learning, educating the world's professionals and preserving company culture.
Welcome, attendees at the IB seminar. Today we're going to be having a little discussion, a roundtable talk actually, with Dean Rocco of Wilson-Elser on what the issues are of the day. And we're talking about COVID and a lot of the laws and rules and regulations and compliance around that. Now we've done really in-depth videos with the insurance board. You can find these videos on their website. But we've done in-depth videos on COVID. We've done in-depth videos on family leave and other topics. So find the full version. That's not what we're here to talk about today. Today we're going to be talking about what are the topic of the day. And Dean, we appreciate you coming today. We really thank you for being in person.
Absolutely. Always love being here.
Yeah, and you know, COVID, it's so complex. It's almost as complex as religion is, right? And it's moving very quickly and it's changing very rapidly. You know, there's a lot of topics that we're probably going to try to hit on today, and it's going to be a short discussion. And if you have any questions, you know, please direct them to Dean and I or to Insurance Board, and we'll be more than happy to answer those for you. And, you know, during this broadcast, we are live in the chat feature, so make sure that you do include any questions and or just, you know, pop in and say hello. One of the questions that was presented to us and they wanted to know from you is, you know, one of the biggest issues surrounding COVID-19 right now is the mandates.
Yep.
You know, the mandates of the religious organizations and or businesses that are out there. Tell us a little about the mandates that you're seeing with COVID right now.
Yeah, so we're really seeing mandates on two fronts, Mike. The first one would be for an employer or a volunteer organization requiring employees or volunteers to be vaccinated or fully vaccinated before they come into a facility. In the context of today's discussion, that would be at the church or the offices of the church. The second one would be for organizations that have public coming into them and putting down mandates that say for you to be a visitor, to come and attend a concert, to attend a worship service, you have to be vaccinated. And they're happening on both fronts. Certainly, we've been talking about vaccine mandates for several months since the beginning of 2021 when we actually had vaccines starting to become available. That conversation's really morphed and picked up in recent weeks with some of the government mandates and some of the difficulties that we've had around the Delta variant. And on the other side, you know, there really was less energy around vaccine passports or mandates for people to attend certain events or go to bars or restaurants. But just like the discussion around mandates for employers, we're starting to see that pick up as well. And really, I would say we're starting to see the discussion picking up speed because of two factors. One is there were certain employers, certain organizations, certain venues that were feeling like they wanted to be part of the vaccination effort. And they wanted to push their employees or push their visitors to be vaccinated, and they were sort of excluding people from working or coming onto property until they were vaccinated. You know, there's some famous cases out there and employers out there, including AT&T, United made the news just this morning. I was reading up on what they were doing, and they're getting ready to lay off a certain number of workers who won't get vaccinated. But that's, I think, less going to be the gas in the engine of this discussion. And I think what's really picked up and is really pushing this thing along now is government mandates. You're starting to see both at a federal and state level, government agencies, departments of health, the President of the United States saying certain people have to be vaccinated. At a federal level, we've got the Biden announcement, and he said that certain federal workers are going to have to be vaccinated. That's not necessarily all that exciting for the folks that'll be watching this program, but you'll have to be very closely watching what those agencies are doing, like OSHA, around sort of offshoots of that executive order. certain employers of certain sizes are expected to be required to have all of their employees vaccinated. Federal contractors, which some of our viewers might actually be, depending on the reach of their religious organization, if the rule comes out and they meet the definition of a federal contractor and they have to be rolling out mandates to be able to receive federal contracts, their workers would have to be vaccinated. And there's some others. I suspect probably not many will be involved in healthcare, although that definition could be broad, and there might be some people that are doing some creative things or are reaching out and providing certain services in healthcare. There are a lot of government mandates, not only at a federal level. Medicare, Medicaid recipients are being required to vaccinate their workers, but also at a state level, we're seeing a lot of Department of Public Health requirements or edicts that those workers be vaccinated. So whether it's just we want to do this because we think it's the right thing, or the government's telling us we have to do this, these mandates are really something that we're starting to see picking up a ton of energy. And a lot of employers are really struggling with whether or not they can do this. If so, how do they roll it out and implement it?
Well, and I was thinking about travel, because if you think about religious organizations, a lot of them do some sort of pilgrimage, or they do some sort of outreach.
Yep.
Our church used to go to Mexico and we'd build churches or schools,
Yep.
Or we'd build water filtration systems, right? And that was every year. So, the travel is going to change as well. And I'm thinking also the mandate on the staff members for them to travel. So if they want to travel to, let's say, wherever, and they require on the bus or require on the airplane or through customs,
Yep.
They might be required to get vaccinated,
Yeah, that's a
or
good
they
thought,
can't
yeah.
continue.
Yep.
Right? So these are the mandates that are coming down that I'm kind of wondering where it's going to start and stop.
Yep.
Where are people going to be able to
Yep.
do it, and how it's going to affect those religious organizations if they choose not to participate in the vaccination. So, mandates are something that they really need to really keep an eye out on. But what about if a religious organization mandates its employees to get vaccinated? Are there any particular things you should tell them that they should think about? I mean, is there something they should be aware of?
Yeah, I know you got a question about exemptions, because we talked about it.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that. But aside from that, I would say if you're a religious organization that's employing people and you're telling them that they have to do something like get vaccinated, the more it becomes a term and condition of employment, the more the employer is going to be on the hook for the costs associated with it and the time associated with it. So it may be that a church that tells its employees that they have to get vaccinated is going to have to compensate them for the time to go get vaccinated or the time associated with getting vaccinated, the expense of travel. Right now, vaccines are cost-free, but we'll talk a little bit in a moment about exemptions. There might be an arrangement that if an individual can't be vaccinated, they have to test every week or every other week or wear masks. The cost of that testing is something that the employer may have to bear depending on the state law where the church
Right.
is. So those sort of costs, wage and hour issues are something I think a lot of employers are needing to be reminded a lot about and shouldn't lose sight of.
Well, and there's also an increase in risk a little bit too, right?
Yep.
Because the employee now is required to get a vaccination or required to get tested. Now they have to leave their place of business to go in someplace. So there's a risk factor of, someone getting in an accident,
Yep.
them getting injured while in that process from point A to point B and point B back to point A.
Yep, that's
Right.
the old coming and going rule, and,
Right.
and no different than if I were driving to the airport to go for a business trip or driving to court to make a court appearance. If that's part of my job and I get injured, it's potentially compensable. The same thing would hold true here. If you say, well, to get this job, you have to be vaccinated, and somebody goes out and does it. Yeah, to your
Right.
point. And the other piece is they might have an adverse reaction. They might become sick. They might trip and fall at the place where they're getting it. There's a whole slew of things that we're starting to see, and claims are starting to bubble up. And so employers just need to be mindful of it, that there are some additional liabilities or risks that they take on when
Yeah.
they roll these things out.
Yeah, the increase definitely in the workers' comp side of things
Yeah, for sure.
potentially. So you mentioned something about exemptions, right? Want to tell us a little about exemptions?
Yeah, so the phone is really ringing off the hook these days for a lot of employers that are struggling with this. And And I would say the exemptions are going to come from two fronts. One of them is going to be a disability, medically related sort of a concern, and the other is going to be a religious concern. On the medical front, it's become fairly straightforward. If an individual comes forward and says, I can't get vaccinated, this all assumes that an employer has a mandate. But if you have the mandate and somebody comes forward and says, I can't comply with it because of a medical reason, an employer can go to that person and say, we need some certification from a healthcare provider. We need some information from you about what's going on. And once you're given that information from a doctor, there's a third party involved, it's pretty easy at that point to become satisfied that there is an underlying concern and move into the discussion around accommodations. Religion is a much different sort of a conversation, and it's a much more difficult one for a lot of employers. There, you're going to get an individual that's going to come forward and say, it's against my religious beliefs to get vaccinated, and the employer is then going to have to grapple with, is there a real religious concern that's going on here, and does the individual sincerely believe in this religious tenet that they're ascribing to? There's a couple different places where that comes from. I say older in the sense of like 6 months ago. The older thing that we were sort of hearing about, at least at the beginning of the rollout of vaccines, when people weren't sort of sure what was going on, was this notion that vaccines are a byproduct of an abortion, and there might be aborted fetal cells in the vaccine itself, or that it was, aborted fetal cells were used to develop it. Most organized religions, particularly those that are affiliated with insurance board, have come forward and said that they don't view that as a concern. And I think really, if you look into the literature, there really is not fetal cell DNA in the vaccines that we're receiving. I think if you were to look back, 50 years ago, you could see an aborted fetus that was used to develop cells, and that fetal cell line, they still use it to test all sorts of drugs today. Those same cells are what are used to develop these vaccines, but it's not in the actual vaccine itself. So a lot of organized religions have come forward and said, even if because of our Christian faith we're against abortion, we're not saying that this
So there's other drugs that we've used over a lifetime
Yeah.
that have these same cells or were used during this process.
Yeah, and they're not like ongoing abortions
Right.
happening that this
Right.
conflicts with, or we're
Right.
supporting abortion by getting them.
Right.
But the other part of it is a little bit more difficult to grasp, and it sort of evolves from some of the teachings, particularly in Christian faiths, where people are pulling Bible verses and saying, because of them, I can't get vaccines, or it's against my religion to get vaccinated. There's really two that I see a lot of. One of them is Corinthians 6:19-20, and it's, or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body. And there's other ones that sort of talk about humans being made in the image of God, or bodies being temples, and individuals are come forward and saying, I can't put a vaccine into my body because of these sort of beliefs. And the others sort of stem from God as a healer, things like Exodus 15:26, for I am the Lord who heals you, or Psalms 147:2, he heals the brokenhearted and bandages their wounds. There's a slew of Bible verses talking about God being
And these
a
are
healer.
and this is what people are utilizing when they claim religious.
Yeah, and without being flip, it sort of is, well, I don't need the vaccine because God will heal me or protect me from COVID-19. There are, I'm sure, cases where those are legitimate religious beliefs of a particular individual, but there are plenty of others where objectively you can see that an individual really isn't coming from a religious belief, it's really coming from a personal belief or an apprehension about the vaccine, and they're sort of putting the religious
Sure.
on top of it to get it. And I've had several requests in the context of healthcare clients, for example, where an individual has come forward and they have a record of medical treatment, because we know they've taken medical leaves and they've received medical treatment and presumably drugs and other things that they put in their body. They're overseeing healthcare to a particular patient. They're administering medications and other things to individuals, and yet when the vaccine popped up, they present a doctor's note saying, I don't believe in basically medicine, and just like that's an objective thing where it becomes difficult for an employer to sort of respond to it. But I would say in the context of this discussion for the insurance board folks, I've not yet seen anything from the UCC or the Presbyterian Church or Disciples of Christ or Reformed Church of America. There's several organizations that the insurance board works with. I've not seen any of them come forward and say that it's against our teachings to get a vaccine. In fact, most of them have come forward and said they're in favor of them. So if your organization is largely comprised of members that are members of that faith group, this is not going to be something that they're going to confront. But that's not to say that you couldn't have somebody that was a church-going member and participating in a UCC organization that might take a personal belief. And then one thing I wanted to leave folks with is that an individual can stray from, they can be a member of a church, but they can sort of have a personal belief that's different from that religion. And so long as the belief itself is religious and they sincerely hold it, it's something that you have to address and potentially accommodate. So you don't just dismiss it offhand because, oh, well, we're a Presbyterian church and you know, our faith leaders have come forward and said we're for vaccines. Therefore, anybody who's Presbyterian can't use this as a reason not to get vaccinated. That's sort of a false premise. You really have to address it on an individualized basis, see why the individual has a concern, and then address it.
You talk about employees or persons that work with the church or work for the church. You know, what about, you know, can the employer talk specific about a person, its status? So, you know, Mike Aberly, you know, works for the church, he is vaccinated, versus another way of saying it.
Yeah, the underlying question here really surrounds privacy, and I would say if you're a religious organization that has a mandate or is investigating a mandate and you're trying to figure out what part of your workforce is vaccinated or if particular individuals have become vaccinated to comply with it, those sort of conversations are legitimate ones and ones that at least the law would say you can have with your employees. Once you receive that information, the law says this is no different than any other medical information, needs to be protected. So
it is protected.
In that context, you'd be prevented from going out and telling somebody from the general public. So, you know, if somebody comes forward and says, I want to be a parishioner, I want to make sure that I know that everybody on your staff is vaccinated. You might be able to make a generalized statement that our staff is vaccinated, but if they said, well, what about that teacher in the Sunday school? Or what about that person over there that's volunteering at a particular event? That's something that organizations that are watching this broadcast should stray away from and not reveal that information, because it's essentially, it's a little bit dramatic, but it's tantamount to saying Mike has a particular disease or underlying health condition. You're revealing their private health information. Right. It's a big no-no.
Because, you know, churches do a lot of community work.
Yep.
You know, they do soup kitchens, and they do it in groups where they don't, let's say, have the soup kitchen, but they go out and be the workforce for the soup kitchen, right? So, you know, you having to say, well, Julie has it where Steve doesn't, or Mike has it and Jason doesn't, right? These are things where they have to be overly cautious and say, no, I can't say that Dean has, you know, COVID. Yep. Right? But what can they say?
So, I mean, they can say things like, we have a mandate, we have a vaccination mandate, our employees are required to get vaccinated unless they meet certain, well, some employers have a flat mandate, there is no exception. Some may have an exception, and you could explain that to the people with whom you're doing business with and have that conversation to see what their comfort level is.
Our staff all has vaccinations.
Yes.
Our staff is not vaccinated, whatever it is.
Yep.
Instead of saying Julie's vaccinated, Steve's vaccinated, you know, et cetera, you just say our staff that will be at your place will be vaccinated.
Yep. And the flip side, though, is if you have an individual that tests positive that's an employee of yours and they are going into a community setting or a client setting or a place where they're interacting with employees or staff members of a different organization, there's a different level of protection around that information. And because an individual might have spread the disease and there's a public health consideration, most instances you'll be able to actually communicate the fact of that health condition to other people to say, we've had an exposure, you were exposed, engage in contact tracing and so forth and so on. So when it comes to talking about vaccination status, probably not. When it comes to talk about we have an actual case, you probably are going to be able to talk a little bit more about
Because they need to
specifics.
trace it backwards. They need to know, hey, if Mike was working with, who was he working with?
Exactly.
You know, and know exactly where they were at the time.
Exactly.
Okay, great. No, that's excellent. And then, you know, there's also some other considerations as well, right? You know, COVID-19 related considerations facing, you know, the Family Leaves Right Act, or sorry, the FMLA.
Yep.
That's what I meant to say.
Well, just the whole disability leave management environment really changed. It was made extremely complicated. I spent a lot of time sort of burrowing through all the different coronavirus response acts under the Trump administration and then under the Biden administration, and then, to see how they would treat this. There were a lot
Sure.
of paid leave programs and time off programs that were rolled out at a federal level, and then many states implemented their own paid time off or unpaid time off rules, and then there were a whole bunch of unemployment and state disability insurance programs that were put in place to address at the very beginning closures, just people not being able to work because they were sheltered in place, followed by a lot of people becoming sick and needing to take time off work and not come in because they were infected, and more recently a lot of people wanting to go and take time off work to get vaccinated. A lot of those benefit programs have now sunsetted almost entirely. The notion that there's specific laws on the books about an individual being able to take time off or be paid for time off because of a COVID-related issue specifically is not really there anymore as we sit here in late September going into October of 2021. But what I would definitely remind people of is don't forget that before COVID ever existed, we had Family Medical Leave Act at a federal level. We had California Family Rights Act at the state level here in California. There are a number of state and local jurisdictions where there are paid family leave programs or paid time off or mandatory sick time programs or unpaid Family Medical Leave Act laws on the books. And if an individual comes forward and says, I need time off because I'm sick or my husband got sick or my child's sick, those sort of reasons are tied to serious health conditions and the type and kind of things that are generally excused and generally have protected leave. So you'll have to really sit down with those employees and make sure that they go out in a documented way, in a way that's able to protect the organization, and then when they come back that their job's preserved if it's required to be preserved. And then in some states like California, we have school activity or school-related leave laws where if an individual's got a kid that needs to have a change in their supervision because of what's going on at school, there may be a qualified reason for them to take off time there. So just because the very, very specific COVID relief sort of acts are going away doesn't change the fact that these may meet the general criteria for some
So
of
if
the
it
paid
wasn't
and unpaid leave.
complicated enough, it just got really complicated.
Well, actually, it's getting less complicated because there's less stuff to layer on top. But I think a
Okay.
lot of people, I've gotten phone calls, particularly from small employers who aren't used to dealing with this. And in a state like California, where the California Family Rights Act just dropped down to employers of 5 or more employees, they're not even aware of this universe.
So a majority of the churches of IB, small or large, are going to now fit into this
If
category.
they're in California, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, so some of them are just forgetting that this stuff exists, but they may have enough employees that they already were qualified. But if you're less than 50 employees in California, you didn't care about this stuff because it didn't apply to you. The Family Medical Leave Act still doesn't apply to you. But if you have more than 5 employees, it now does. So this is a world that they're not even used to dealing with. And they're thinking, okay, we've checked off all the boxes. We've got all the COVID stuff done. It doesn't apply anymore. We'll just go back to our standard paid time off vacation policy. Maybe we'll give some people some leaves. Not realizing that there's this giant law sitting out there that now applies to them that says that individual not only has a right to time off, but you have to protect their job and bring them back to the same or a comparable job. And they're just violating the law and not even realizing that it exists or that it applies to them now. So that's a big thing that people need to be watching out for.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when you have very specific jobs within a church organization. You know, worship ministry leader. Kids youth ministry leader. And if there's only one position, if you don't bring them back in the proper way, that
Yeah.
church is going to be violating a lot of state law here in California,
Yeah,
at least.
and these smaller companies, it's very difficult for them to be able to say, well, we have 10 people on staff, and you lose one of them, you lose 10% of your workforce.
That's a lot of people.
The natural inclination is we need to bring somebody in tomorrow to fill that spot, and we'll deal with it later, and they don't handle it the right way, and all of a sudden that person's out for 3 months. They're wanting to come back into the organization, and they're saying we don't have a job for anymore.
Right.
That you've just violated the California Family Rights Act.
Right. So I really appreciate it. And your in-depth videos that we find on Insurance Board go into really depth on this type of stuff. And
Yep,
and
we've
if they
talked
have
about coming back to worship, we've
Yep.
talked about returning people back to the workplace, all
Yeah.
that stuff's out there, and those obligations still exist.
Yeah.
You still have to take those OSHA or workplace safety things very seriously, and make sure that you're not losing sight of those as we continue along. But yeah, those programs are all on the Insurance Board's COVID site.
Well, that's great. And you know what? And I really appreciate, you coming today and talking to the people at IB. They always appreciate it. I mean, and I know they can find a lot of this material online, but if they have questions, they can reach out to, I know, you or myself, and we'd be more than happy to. And then there's the entire staff of Insurance Board
Yep.
who are knowledgeable on this very thought. So thank you everyone for joining today. We really do appreciate it. Please, again, drop us a line, leave us some notes in the comments right there, and we'll be happy to try to answer those for you. So thank you for joining, and we appreciate it. God be with you.
MINDMELD Learning, educating the world's professionals and preserving company culture.